Hello, I'm Ron Edwards with ChineseEconomicHistory.com, and we're here today at the World Economic History Congress being held in Kyoto. This is a auspicious occasion in that this is the first time that the World Economic History Congress is being held in the Far East. It's been traditionally held in the United States and Europe and other places. But it's particularly exciting for Chinese economic historians, and so today we're having a series of interviews with prominent economic historians. And we're honored today to have Professor Thomas Rawski, who his PhD is from Harvard, and he is a professor of economics at the University of Pittsburgh. And we also have Evelyn Rawski, who also received her PhD from Harvard, and is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Pittsburgh. Professor Rawski is known mainly for long-run studies of Chinese economic performance, and Evelyn Rawski is known for late imperial China studies. In particular, Professor Thomas Rawski is known for, among other things, a book he co-edited and also contributed to, China's Great Economic Transformation, published by Cambridge University Press, and also China's Rise and Balance of Influence in Asia, published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. Evelyn Rawski wrote a book early on that was quite influential called Agricultural Change and the Peasant Economy in South Asia.
South China.
South China, I'm sorry. And that was published by Harvard University Press. So today I'd just like to simply start off with asking both of you how you got interested in Chinese economic history.
Well, I started out as a physics major and then became an economics major very quickly. And so at that point I became interested in China because I became interested in learning Chinese. And one thing led to another.
I see. And Tom?
I became interested in China when I was perhaps 11 or 12 years old. My grandparents in Australia sent me books. One was about China, one was about India. Then when I was an undergraduate, I was wanting to study both Chinese history and Latin American history, even though I too started as a physics major, but that didn't last too long. I switched to mathematics and then to economics. And then I became sick. I had to cut down my course load. And for some reason, I cut out Latin American rather than Chinese history. So I started Chinese history. I studied with Knight Biggerstaff, who was the modern China historian at Cornell University at that time. And then I enrolled in his seminar on modernization of China. And I became interested in the commercial activity in Chinese treaty ports in the 19th century.
And where was this at?
This was at Cornell.
Okay.
I was an undergraduate. And I was fascinated by the treaty port literature, even with very, very limited Chinese at that time. I could read vast quantities of materials. There were newspapers. There were trade statistics I could work with. And I was also interested in the Chinese hyperinflation of the 1940s. So I was aiming to write 2 papers, but I was just consumed by the treaty port topic, and I eventually dropped the inflation topic because there simply wasn't time to do this. So when I began graduate school, I was actually interested in historical subjects, and then I gradually changed my focus to contemporary China. And so my dissertation was about the economy of the People's Republic of China, but there was a historical chapter. And from then on, I guess I was following the example of my mentor and also Evelyn's, Dwight Perkins, who essentially divided his time between contemporary studies and historical studies. So I've bounced back and forth ever since.
I see.
And right now I'm in somewhat of a historical phase.
So Dwight Perkins was both of your advisors in graduate school, or
Well,
you worked with him?
He was a supplementary advisor for me because my first advisor was a historian, Yang Lianshang. But of course, Professor Yang could not evaluate the economic analysis, and so I had Dwight on my committee.
I see.
And Dwight also introduced us, actually.
I see.
Let's not
Yeah.
go into that.
Okay, mum's the word on that. That's fine. Well, thank you very much for that that information. That's quite interesting to find out how many Chinese economic historians eventually found their way into this field. It's not it's quite a rare subfield within the economics and the history profession, but a bit less so. Let me first ask Professor Tom Rawski, in your books, China's Great Economic Transformation, for which you contributed and also were a co-editor, and also China's Rise and Balance of Influence in Asia, in the same way you contributed and were a co-author. In these two books, can you tell us a little bit about your contributions in what you wrote and also the book in general?
Well, the Great Economic Transformation volume was an effort to essentially summarize what happened during the first several decades of the Chinese economic reforms that began in the late 1970s. So what we were trying to do was to put China specialists together with generalists. So for example, I, together with my co-editor Lauren Brandt, wrote a chapter on industrial development, and we wrote that with John Sutton, who is an industrial organization specialist at London School of Economics. And our idea in forming these groups was to bring in the subject specialists to keep the work focused on the broad issues and avoid getting bogged down in the minutiae of Chinese statistics and Chinese fluctuations. And so on. And this was, I think this was pretty successful. It took us 8 years to put this volume together. The group got together twice. We lost a year because of the SARS epidemic in China in 2003, so nobody could go and do any sort of field work. And I think that volume has held up pretty well. It's now 7 years since the volume came out, probably about 10 years since most of the research is finished. Somebody should update this, and I mean, now from today's perspective, it's possible to take a longer run view of what's been going on since 1978, but my thought is that nobody will be foolish enough to take on this job for quite a while, so that book may stand up for a few years yet.
I see. For Evelyn, could you please explain to our audience a bit about your book, Agricultural Change in the Peasant Economy of South China?
Well, I began the book because I was interested in seeing how much economic data one could get from a very common kind of primary source, local gazetteers. And so that was what really led me to the subject. And then I became interested in the impact and whether one could say something more specific and precise about the impact of the foreign trade that emerged along the southeast China coast in the 16th century. And I found that one could say something about that, both in terms of the impact on the local society, meaning examination degree success. And so, you know, it was really an exercise in looking at the development of foreign trade markets and the commodities that fit into that market, and then turning around and then looking at the examination degree records before the foreign trade really developed and then after, and looking at the process.
I see. And for both of you, are there any other publications that you're particularly interested in, or felt that were quite influential, or your favorites other than these papers or books or anything in particular?
Well, I guess I would mention two things. One, I wrote a book about economic growth in pre-war China, which is about the early decades of the 20th century. My idea in doing this was to get away from trying to put together numbers, which I had been doing for a long time and studying the People's Republic, and ironically it turned out that's exactly what I ended up doing, trying to compile time series of industrial output, agricultural output, national income, per capita income, and so on. So I spent a lot of time doing that, and I think it's had a certain amount of impact. And perhaps I could say something about what I'm involved in now, that I've been working with two colleagues, Lauren Brandt at the University of Toronto and Debin Ma, who's at the London School of Economics, and we're trying to think about China's economic performance over the long term. And I think what started us thinking about this is you have this enormous economic boom occurring in China in the last several decades. And at the same time, the historical literature is, to a certain extent, preoccupied with China as a case of economic failure. And it's the same place. So there's got to be a narrative that links what happened in the 19th and early 20th century, or what didn't happen in the 19th and early 20th century, with what happened later on in the 20th century, and there is no such link now. And so we're trying to develop a framework for looking at the economy that allows us to explain, or try to explain, both the 19th century outcomes and the early 20th century outcomes and the big boom.
I see.
So the first result of this project is a review essay that we published last year in the Journal of Economic Literature, and we are trying to extend this. Again, we're slow. We began the review essay in 2007. It was published in 2014.
I see.
But we hope, in fact, we were joking this morning, will we be ready for the next World Economic History Congress in 3 years? And I've given up announcing deadlines. So I hope we will be ready for the World Economic History Congress in 3 years, but make no promises.
Well, I think that perhaps the most relevant for economic historians is my work on popular literacy, which looked at, ordinary people whose literacy would not count in official records in terms of, it's not advanced literacy, but who know enough to keep accounts or to function in farm markets and stuff like that. So that was a study that looked at the kinds of opportunities that existed, the primers that existed for people to learn how to read at a very, under, maybe 1,000 characters, at 500 characters, something like that. This is actually for long before the 20th century. So that was my, and recently I've strayed a great deal from economic history. And my most recent project has been, I've just published a book on early modern China and Northeast Asia, where I look at, in part, at the impact of European markets on Asian shores and the domestic impact in China, Japan, Korea in the late 16th and early 17th centuries.
I see. So you've both begun to look at a bit longer periods of time span. So I'd like to ask you, because this is one of the themes of ChineseEconomicHistory.com, and our target is basically economists in the West. For most economists in the West, you're taught from day one that the world and virtually every country makes a transition from a Malthusian trap to modern economic growth, the only issues being is when and how. And I'd just like to ask you, do you think China fits this traditional economic view of the world?
Perhaps not terribly well. I think looking at the long term, it's a bit hard to see the Malthusian trap because we don't see much evidence of diminishing returns. It seems that as population increased and as population density increased, and here I'm thinking about the work by Dwight Perkins on Chinese agriculture from 1368 to 1968, what seems to happen is that the labor force can apply itself in part to building agricultural infrastructure, improving the quality of the land, improving irrigation, and so on, with the result that there is, at least in Perkins' work, no sign of a long-term decline in per capita supply of food, which is the essence of the Malthusian argument. Now, we've just come from a session at this Congress where the new work reporting findings of declining levels of per capita income in China during the Ming-Qing period, that is, for, say, roughly from 1500 to 2000 to 1900. I'm a bit skeptical about the
decline.
These findings. I mean, we have to look at the underlying database. I'm concerned that there seems to be a sort of race for long-term quantification in the China field going on just now. At this Congress, there are at least 3 or 4 papers that are offering new measures of long-term economic trends. I've been joking that I'm waiting for the quarterly data to come out for the 18th century. But someone was saying to me this morning that 25 years ago, when the Dutch historians started producing national income indicators going back a long time for the Netherlands, the data were very bad and the results were not impressive. But they've been working at it for a quarter of a century, and this gentleman said now the best data are for the Netherlands and for England. That is historical time series data, and this gentleman was saying that I shouldn't be too quick to criticize these new studies because we may well be at the start of a new era of quantification of long-term trends in China, and that 10 or 20 years from now we may have very good data. And I think that's a fair comment because now people are discovering all kinds of new information. So people are finding merchant account books with information about wages, about prices, about the exchange between copper and silver currency, and so on. So I think this is there's a lot of ferment in the field right now, which is very promising, and it's it's really part of globalization. We're looking at globalization of economic history studies, and that people are turning to both China and Japan, also India and Indonesia, and trying to replicate the sort of studies that are available for England, for France, for Holland, for Turkey, and of course for North America and Russia as well. So it's a good time to be thinking of economic history.
I see.
So I think that James Lee and his collaborators, their studies on demographic history, suggest some degree of spacing of births, which of course would be important for thinking about the Malthusian trap. And also, of course, the evidence of infanticide, which, I mean, I know it's often treated as, well, it's a last resort, it's people are really pressed for resources, but it can also be seen, I mean, if we remove the moral element, as a decision made, economically rational decision, I think. And so I think that one has to do more there has to be more research done before we can really decide what the contours of the pressures on the economy were from the demographic side.
But relative to the West, do you think it was, can we say enough, do we know enough to say it was at least a bit different?
It was certainly a bit different.
Okay.
You know, the thing about spinsters in Western Europe, okay, so the voluntary celibacy, if you want to call it that, you know, so they remove a certain number of fertile women from the giving birth. But on the other hand, when we think that maybe 15% of males in China were too poor to marry, I mean, that's also removing
Sure.
people from potential fatherhood. And
Just going back to the second portion of your question, it's absolutely the case that China has embarked on a process of modern economic growth. And we see this beginning in the early decades of the 20th century. So that my conclusion from my study of economic growth in pre-war China was that in the decades prior to the outbreak of the Pacific War, so essentially from 1910 to 1936, there is an increase in output per capita, and there's an increase in agricultural output per capita, and there are increases in consumption as well in per capita terms. These are not large increases. The increases are very small compared to what we've seen in China in the past several decades. But there's little question in my mind that the averages are notably higher for both output and consumption per capita in the 1930s than they are 25 years earlier.
I see. And a final question that I just cannot resist asking, because I work on this, is China in the Song Dynasty. Now, quantitative evidence is quite shaky on this. We have pretty much no hope that we can see on the horizon of constructing any type of national accounts in order to produce GDP estimates. But there are indicators, but not only quantitative, but there's a lot of qualitative evidence in, say, for example, discoveries of kiln sites and things like this. The written accounts of the popularization of tea amongst a bunch of new classes in China and so forth. So I can't ask you your view on GDP per capita in the Song Dynasty, but I'd like to ask you what's your impression of the economic performance of the Song Dynasty based on all the evidence that's available? That's a bit out of your field, but as China experts, it's fair game for a general audience. And if you feel you don't feel comfortable.
Well, of course, I began life as a Ming historian.
Okay.
So I have a bias against, because my question is, if the Song had all of the attributes that the Ming did.
Yes.
That's a question in my mind. Did it have, all of the attributes? Because we do talk about commercialization, monetization, urbanization, all of these as major trends in the Ming period.
Yes.
And so if the Song was equally,
equally growing,
I mean, if these trends were at the same level, then what happened between the Song and the Ming? Mm-hmm. And I really think that to say that, well, the Mongol invasion occurred and conquest is not adequate as an answer. So in my mind, it's still an open question.
Okay.
I don't have a research knowledge of this period, but I think that a number of specialists in this period have gone way too far in trying to put numbers on qualitative changes. You say there is no sufficient evidence to construct estimates of national product, but I have seen that people have constructed estimates of national product, and they don't make a lot of sense internally, even without deep research knowledge of the period, which I don't have. And I'm pleased to see that some specialists in that period, such as yourself, are skeptical of these what I consider to be over-enthusiastic claims about growth in output per capita, about industrialization, because I think these claims are based on speculative interpretation of very narrow items of evidence. And actually, I think some of the greatest enthusiasts of Song intensive growth are people who can't read Chinese. The people who are the Europeanists who can't possibly interpret the evidence. But I fear that some of our sinological colleagues have egged them on by producing high but dubious estimates, for example, of iron production for the Song period.
Yeah, my own view is actually, if there's going to be a case that's going to be made for per capita growth in Song China, it's not going to rely heavily on quantitative data. The iron output data, Wagner has shown that we can't say anything definitively because the basic sources, we don't know if they overlap, and there's also a 10% assumption of tax, which has been questioned and so on. But my experience has also been that the qualitative evidence has been relatively overwhelming in that sense. But that's yet to be documented. But that's actually my current work. So yeah.
If we're going to talk about per capita, we need to know how many people. And for the Song period, we don't. There are figures on number of households, and there are wildly varying figures on household size. So this is a very basic issue, and people come and say, well, I think that household size is this.
Yes.
But what of other people who say that's this or that?
And the population changes.
So there's just there is a tendency for excessive quantification. I have seen an account of the Song Dynasty where they talk about how much of the grain goes to producing liquor on a year-by-year basis with many decimal points. And it's impossible. You could not make that calculation for any period of 20th or 21st century China. How can we do it for 1,000 years? Yes.
Yeah, the quantitative evidence is definitely rough indicators at best. It's very rough indicators at best. But yeah, I think those together with qualitative evidence have a chance, but that's yet to be done. So there's good reason for skepticism, but there's also the doors open also for hope, at least from my side, but that's a whole agenda of work for another group of people. Yeah, and I do agree that the numbers are, the best numbers you can put out are rough guesstimates, and we don't know what's behind a lot of them and things. And I think the quantitative evidence, and you give it back to 1,000 years ago, you just can't swallow it. I mean, look at the debates going on right now about hedonic pricing on these things. Those are debates about data 10, 20 years ago, and they're screaming and yelling. And 1,000 years ago, someone no hope. Just to be honest and say they're indicators. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. But anyway, enough about that. And we hope you enjoy your time here at the World Economic History Congress at Kyoto, and thank you very much for having an interview with us.
Thank you for the invitation.